All right, thank you for all your patience. Great to see such strong interest in the webinar. I can see a lot of likes coming in. So with that, we'll begin now, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you the new chair of the IPSASB, Thomas Müller-Marqués Berger, who is joining us today to provide opening and closing remarks. So Thomas, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone, and dear colleagues. It is a pleasure also for me to have you joining us for this global IPSASB webinar introducing IPSASB SRS1 climate-related disclosures, the inaugural IPSASB SRS standard issued by the board for the public sector. Before Karen and Alex are diving into the details of these new standards, it is important for me to highlight two key points up front. One key point is, why is there a need for IPSASB SRS1? And the first aspect to mention is that governments play a fundamental role in climate action of the global community as a whole, as their actions and decisions can shape outcomes across the entire economy, including private households. So transparent information on these actions and decisions is needed. And provided that climate-related information is based on well-defined standards requirements and transparently reported by governments, it enables valuable insights for decision makers, resource providers, and service recipients into the climate-related risks and opportunities that might affect government's ability to meet service delivery and financial commitments both now and in the future. And for that reason, developing and reporting climate-related information based on globally harmonized standards is essential for stronger public financial management. Further, consistent and comparable reporting information on climate-related risks and opportunities allows monitoring their development over time as a result of government's actions. And this creates and increases transparency for stakeholders and holds the public sector accountable for the achievement of climate-related targets and commitments. And finally, the new public sector reports and disclosures, which are aligned with the private sector where suitable, enable more efficient access to capital markets where governments have to compete for financial resources with businesses. And this ultimately helps mobilizing the additional financing needed to strengthen climate resilience. So in a nutshell, this is why globally harmonized sustainability reporting of the public sector is so essential. And this is why the IPSASB developed IPSASB SRS1, about which we are talking today. The second point I want to highlight upfront is my continued support for the development of the IPSASB SRS standards. Karen mentioned it. As the new chair of the IPSASB, I'm convinced of the need for and the power of globally harmonized accounting and reporting standards. And I therefore strongly support this important work on developing such standards for sustainability reporting of the public sector. And that said, I can assure you that the IPSASB remains committed to continuing the development of the IPSASB SRS standards as part of our work setting standards for the public sector. It is my deep conviction that this work is critical to meeting the growing information needs of users of general purpose financial reports and to ensuring that public sector reporting is globally consistent, decision useful, and fit for purpose. But equally important, I'm strongly encouraging the adoption and implementation of these standards in the public sector. Sustainability reporting is a new area for all of us, standard setters, preparers, auditors, and users of such information. And only if we undertake first practical steps and bring the standards to life, we can commonly gain experience and insights into what really creates value and what might need to be improved going forward. So in light of this, thank you again for joining us today. I very much look forward to hearing insightful questions from you. And with that, I now turn it over to the team and to present an overview of the project background and the detailed disclosure requirements. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas, for your insightful opening remarks and for setting the tone for today's conversation and this webinar. Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Leung. I am a manager at the IPSASB. I currently lead our climate-related disclosures project. And with me here is my colleague, Alex Metcalfe, who I will pass over now to introduce himself and also take you through the first part of today's agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Karen and Thomas. Great to hear your opening remarks to set us on the right tone as we move into this important introductory webinar on IPSASB SRS1 climate-related disclosures. My name is Alex Metcalfe, and I've had the privilege of working as a principal consultant very closely with Karen on this project for climate-related disclosures. And today, what I'd like to do is start by taking us through a few elements that I'll begin with, and here they are. So we'll first do a project background and give you just a little bit of the history that's led us up to this really important milestone for the IPSASB in the sustainability reporting space. We'll then move into the overview of disclosure requirements, where I'll start us off on that and then hand over to Karen to continue us through to give you that overview. And then we have a really important component of today's discussion, and that's our audience Q&A. And we're really keen that today we hear from you in this important milestone, such that you're able to provide us with as many questions as you can. And Karen and I are going to do our best to be able to then address these through the time available, before we then turn back to Thomas to offer his closing remarks and thinking about the way forward. So let's start then by first turning to what's really brought us all together today, and that's the inaugural IPSASB SRS standard. So the issuance just a few weeks ago of IPSASB SRS1, climate-related disclosures, by the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. And this standard is designed specifically for the public sector context to help our public sector entities with reporting on their climate-related risks and opportunities, and was developed in support from the World Bank as well, in bringing this together for launch just a few weeks ago. So as you can see on the slide here, it was published just on the 28th of January, so the very latest edition for the IPSASB's suite of standards, and will be effective from January 1st of 2028. And just to give everyone a bit of an overview on the next slide here in terms of the IPSASB itself, and I think for many of you, you'll be well aware of this, but always useful to start on this to give us a similar foundation. The IPSASB plays a really important role in global public financial management, acting as an independent standard-setting body that sets both financial reporting and sustainability reporting standards for the public sector. It's been setting these financial reporting standards for about 30 years now, where on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's now a full suite of accrual-based IPSAS that have been developed. And alongside that, there's 3 recommended practice guidelines, the RPGs. And of course, we can now add to this list with IPSASB SRS1, so our first sustainability reporting standard by the IPSASB. And I think maybe one other thing just to mention on this slide is the really important role played by the volunteer 18 board members, as well as the funding that comes through from a range of different stakeholders, and the critical function of independent oversight that's provided. And all of this broader ecosystem coming together, supporting the due process and standard setting that's done by the IPSASB. That's brought us to today as well for IPSASB SRS1. So with that overview, then I'd like to take us back a little bit in time to the initial genesis of this project that's brought us to SRS1. And that started with a World Bank report that was issued in early 2022 that called on the IPSASB to lead a global consultation on whether they would be the right body for developing public sector sustainability reporting. And this consultation was issued just a few months after that initial publication by the World Bank. So you'll see on here, it was from May 2022, closing then in September. asking three kind of critical questions then of global constituents in terms of whether the IPSASB was the appropriate body to take this forward, thinking about the initial projects that would be prioritized by global constituents. And of course, one of the things that we heard also very strongly within the consultation paper was that this guidance was actually needed with haste. So there's real urgency that came back in response for a demand for this guidance to be developed. And what we saw then was the work of the IPSASB on the next slide to move from the consultation paper to developing an exposure draft, which from that date in September of 2022 brought us forward to the publication of this exposure draft in, it was October, end of October of 2024. And from that hard work of the IPSASB and the broader ecosystem to develop this exposure draft, we then had a period of consultation and outreach lasting into early 2025, where there was the largest outreach actually that the board has undertaken for this particular exposure draft, resulting in some of the statistics that you see on the slide in front of us. So the board had here a full series of different roundtables that were held across different jurisdictions, including a global virtual session that reached out to a total of 755 different participants, where there was really rich insight captured through the Slido platform there as well, which we'll be using for our Q&A later today. But I think importantly, if we look on the right-hand slide, we see that there was an unprecedented level of response as a result of this global outreach, with 96 written consultation responses coming back from a broad range of geography represented, as well as different types of entity, from international organizations to local government, developing economies, a full range of perspectives that came back for the IPSASB to then consider. And with all of this then in place, we had a proposal from the board, if you come to the next slide, within this exposure draft that was articulated as the dual role of government. And of course, this started, if we turn to the exposure draft, with the latest international agreements as an important foundation and anchor in thinking about the ways in which public sector entities undertake climate action. And when we think about these latest international agreements on climate change, we might be thinking of the Paris Agreement that or the UN SDGs, which most countries around the world have signed up to. And in then applying these international agreements and the activities that are unique to public sector entities, the board considered at the exposure draft level that there were really two different reporting perspectives that you can see on the slide here. So the one on the left relates to what was described at the ED phase as own operations, or what you might call the day-to-day activities of an entity. So this could be providing a public service in terms of running a school, administering healthcare services through a local GP or a hospital, or providing local community services and recreation facilities. All of this are examples of day-to-day activities of public sector entities. And in this case, the board put forward in the ED that in many cases, it's appropriate that the disclosures here would be aligned with the private sector equivalent guidance that you'd find within IFRS S2. So this is from the International Sustainability Standards Board. But if we look at the right-hand side of the slide, this brings us to the second reporting perspective that was articulated within the exposure draft. It was described as the climate-related public policy programs that are unique to the public sector context. So these are public policy programs that are the application of sovereign power by a public sector entity, so the use of its regulatory power, its policy authority, to actually then have consequences or an impact on the different actors that you see on the slide here. So they might be able to have an impact on private corporations, on households, and their behavior and the activities that they take forward. And it was the view of the IPSASB, and very much supported from what we heard from the exposure draft, that this second reporting perspective was incredibly important when we thought about the climate-related disclosures that are relevant in the public sector context. But once we moved through to the deliberations on this ED by the IPSASB, which was happening as we moved into the March 2025 meeting, moving ahead last year, there was a really important milestone that the board came to in the June 2025 meeting, which was a decision to split this particular project into two phases. So here we had in June the decision of these two reporting perspectives that I've just shared with you to be moved into a phase one that then focuses on an entity's day-to-day activities and has brought us forward to today with the approval and publication of IPSASB SRS1 climate-related disclosures. And then in addition, we have what's now been described as phase two of the project, focused on public policy programs, which the board will now be taking up as we move into 2026 and have our the board meetings coming through quarterly in this calendar year, where the board will be analyzing the responses to the ED specific to the second phase on public policy programs, with an intention to then move towards an approval of that guidance in the time ahead. Maybe the one other thing that I'd highlight on this slide that was really critical in the deliberations of the IPSASB was the fact that even as we come to today and the launch of IPSASB SRS1, there was real focus by the board on the fact that this is a new space for many public sector entities, for many parts of the public financial management ecosystem. And therefore, there would be a critical focus that the board would need to have on developing relevant implementation material. So you'll see that there on the top right of the slide of the continued focus within the broader climate-related disclosures project of developing appropriate implementation material that can support entities with the adoption and implementation of IPSASB SRS1. So that gives you an overview of the background on the project that's brought us to today. And what I'd like to do now between myself and with Karen is to take you just at a high level through some of the specific disclosure requirements that you'll find in IPSASB SRS1. And I hope that collectively, through Karen and my efforts, that'll give you a good sense of what sits under the hood within this particular standard and how it might be relevant for your thinking in terms of what it might mean for your entity or your own context in the work that you do. So if we move to the first slide, let's start really just from the top of IPSASB SRS1, and that's looking at the objective. So this is, in fact, paragraph 1 of IPSASB SRS1, where here, when we look at the objective, that's articulated as setting out a series of principles for an entity to disclose the material information on its climate-related risks and opportunities. And this should be the climate-related risks and opportunities that are useful to primary users within their GPFRs for accountability and decision-making purposes. And there's a lot of really critical terminology within that objective. Maybe just a couple of things to bring out for everyone here. One is the focus on the climate-related risks and opportunities. And that is really the kind of the central focus, if you'd like, of this standard and what that means for an entity's day-to-day activities in providing service to service recipients. But also I'd point out here the focus on accountability and decision-making. So these two ideas are very much grounded in the IPSASB's conceptual framework. And I hope for many of you that connects nicely between what the work that the IPSASB has been doing on financial reporting over the last 3 decades, coming in then now to sustainability reporting in a public sector context and the purpose and objective of these disclosures. We also have right at the top of the standard setting out the scope of the disclosures, where we're focusing quite importantly on the material information for our climate-related risks and opportunities. And then in the scope, we also have another public sector specific element here, which is a focus on long-term fiscal sustainability of the entity. And one thing I'd like to highlight for you here, when we think about long-term fiscal sustainability, one element that's come up in some other discussions that Karen and I have had over the last number of months is that this is inclusive of the service delivery of that entity. So we're not narrowly just looking at the financial implications in terms of financial sustainability. This is a broader view, if you look at the definition of long-term fiscal sustainability, looking at the ability of an entity to continue in delivering its services into the long term. Another very common question that Karen and I get on this is in terms of application of IPSASB SRS1. And if you look quite close to the top of the standard again, I think it's paragraph 6, if you can correct me, Karen, if I've got that one right, that this standard can be applied irrespective of what an entity is doing in terms of their financial reporting. So if, let's say, for example, a public sector entity is operating on a partial accrual basis at this point in time, they might actually be fully compliant with IPSASB SRS1 at the same time. Or you could have someone on a full accrual basis or even a cash basis who is applying IPSAS. So these sit as separate application between these suites of standards, an important point that we often get asked about in our outreach. So let's move on then and turn our attention to the structure of IPSASB SRS1, which you'll see here on the next slide. And maybe to start, I'd actually like to bring your attention just to the top right of the slide here to draw us back to the initial work that the board did from the consultation paper leading up to the ED, which was a strong signal from constituents that the board should be building on private sector guidance. So not starting from a blank piece of paper in how it seeks to develop public sector sustainability reporting, but instead, as you'd see here, would look to build on existing guidance where appropriate, such as IFRS S1 and S2, as developed by the International Sustainability Standards Board, as well as GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and some of the work that's been done there on impact reporting. And the result of this means that if we look at the core text and application guidance within IPSASB SRS1, there's an overall structure here that should be familiar to many who are working in the broader sustainability reporting space. And that's a focus on the TCFD pillars of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets that provides us with this useful structure across the core text and the specific disclosure requirements for a public sector entity, as well as the accompanying application guidance, that authoritative guidance that then supports the core text. And for this, there's a great deal that is drawn from IFRS S2, which you'll see on the left-hand side of the slide here, from the private sector work on climate-related disclosure with important public sector adaptations. But the board also turns to IFRS S1 and the board's own conceptual foundations, the conceptual framework, in developing the appendices that you see on the right-hand side. So this covers Appendix B, BAG, and Appendix C as well, covering the conceptual foundations, the general requirements, and qualitative characteristics that collectively make IPSASB SRS1 a standalone standard, if you like, something that can operate on its own with the necessary conceptual foundations in place for an entity to be able to undertake reporting on its day-to-day activities and its climate-related disclosures. So together, this means that this is something that any individual public sector entity would be able to pick up and use to move ahead with that day-to-day activity reporting and wouldn't have to then look to other conceptual foundations across other existing guidance. And for us to come to the next slide, then, what I'd like to share with you here is just a little bit more detail on the specific disclosure requirements that you'll find within IPSASB SRS1, where these seek to provide information about climate-related risks and opportunities that could affect an entity's day-to-day activities. And I think it's important to share with everyone today that the intention of the board here and its thinking is that there's the expectation that these disclosure requirements would be applicable to all public sector entities and their various service delivery functions. If that is running a school or a hospital, providing maybe local job-seeking services is another example of this. So thinking about the offices and staff that support all of the day-to-day activities of a public sector entity. But then, of course, if we look over to the right-hand side here, we have a little bit more detail, at least at a high level, on the disclosure requirements that you'll find sitting under these 4 TCFD pillars that are drawn from IFRS S2. So if we look at governance at the top, this relates to the disclosures on the oversight and management, monitor, manage, and oversee climate-related risk and opportunity. For strategy, there's a variety of really important disclosures here that cover an entity's strategy and decision-making processes, looking at its current and anticipated financial effects from climate-related risk and opportunity, as well as turning to climate resilience of that entity's strategy and its operational model. So that includes work on the climate scenario analysis that an entity would be required to undertake. On risk management, this focuses on an entity's risk management processes and policies to identify, assess, and prioritize climate-related risk and opportunity. And then for metrics and targets, this is where we see for an entity that it's required to then disclose its performance indicators and targets, and the ones that it uses in terms of thinking about its strategic goals, as well as, of course, looking to scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions. That these are then required, which should be in line with the GHG protocol, unless there's another established methodology that that entity would look to use. There is actually specific guidance within the standard saying that if you don't have to use the GHG protocol, if there's other reasonable methodology that you should be using in your context, but that's an expectation that you would be using it otherwise. You'd be starting from the GHG protocol. Good. And then a final slide that I'll share with you, just to give you a sense of how the IPSASB is built on the private sector guidance in IFRS 2 alignment, is to set out for you some of what's the same and then some of what's different as well. And from here, I'll then hand over to Karen to take us through the final elements of the disclosure requirements and giving you an overview of the standard. So if you look through the center of the slide here, we see some of the core elements that are the same between IPSASB SRS 1 on climate-related disclosures and IFRS S2. So this includes the use of the TCFD framework, focus within GPFR, and the fact that we are also making use of scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions. When we look to the left-hand side, you'll see some of the examples of elements that are then specific to IFRS S2. And I might actually just frame this for the sake of time on the right-hand side to tell you what's specifically unique with it in terms of public sector elements in IPSASB SRS 1. So one part of this we actually talked about. So looking at primary users within the public sector context, service recipients and resource providers being a broader lens than you would focus on with your investor community within IFRS S2. There's also a variety of public sector terminology and adaptations that are included within this standard. We used in our introductions here the example of long-term fiscal sustainability as one of those public sector specific terms. And finally, the term that I was trying to grasp at in the last slide and is helpfully available here is that we have a rebuttable presumption on the GHG protocol. And I hope that was a useful overview for you in understanding the application of the GHG protocol within IFRS, within IPSASB SRS 1. So with that, I'm very happy to hand over to Karen to take you through the remaining slides in this section. Karen.
Thanks, Alex. So moving us on to another key element of the IPSASB SRS 1, which is on general requirements. And as Alex said this earlier in the structure of the standard, these provide us with the essential principles that support and operationalize the standard for the preparation of climate-related disclosures to ensure that the information is useful for primary users of the report. And these include general requirements on the reporting entity. So reporting for climate-related disclosures should be provided by the same reporting entity as the related financial statements. There are also general requirements on location of disclosures and timing of reporting, which state that these climate-related disclosures should be disclosed within an entity's general purpose financial reports and also reported at the same time. And also another general requirement that I'd like to highlight here is on connected information, where an entity shall provide information that would enable primary users to understand the connections between different sets of information. So here we're looking at, for example, between climate-related disclosures, between financial statements, and across other GPFRs. But the conceptual foundation that we'd like to highlight the most here is materiality, where the IPSASB SRS 1 states that entities should provide disclosures of information that is material to its primary users, as you see in the definition that's highlighted on the slide above here. And so in deciding this definition of materiality, the IPSASB considered the different approaches in sustainability reporting to think about what was actually appropriate in the context of public sector climate-related disclosures. And so as a part of that, we looked at the ongoing sustainability landscape and the different labels that currently exist outside in terms of materiality. And that includes, as some of you may be very familiar with, double materiality, impact materiality, financial materiality, to name a few. But then ultimately, the IPSASB decided that we would look to our own IPSASB literature, where the IPSASB's own conceptual framework has a materiality definition, which we have taken on the slide here, where the focus of materiality is grounded in the information needs of primary users and would ultimately require professional judgment, given that materiality is something that is very highly entity specific. And so if we look at this materiality definition on the slide here, a few key parts that I'd like to highlight is first primary users, which includes service recipients and resource providers. And then the context of this materiality definition, this is a much broader and multi-stakeholder approach that that is applied to the public sector context and would encompass different user information needs. And here we're looking at, for example, citizens and taxpayers who might be primary users of public sector general purpose financial reports. And the objectives of reporting here are to support users in valuing information for decision making. And another key part of this materiality definition is the discharge of accountability by the entity. And this materiality definition also supports the connectivity between financial and sustainability reporting. And that's through aligning definitions across IPSASB literature. As you see, we're aligning with the IPSASB's conceptual framework here, and also with the ISSB private sector guidance. And so these general requirements, particularly with the definition of materiality that's grounded in the information needs of primary users, are very important to us to understanding this distinctive nature of the IPSASB SRS-1. And that's because, as I had said before, the IPSASB conceptual framework defines primary users as service recipients and resource providers. And therefore, in the context of this materiality definition, when we look at material information in the IPSASB SRS-1, this would reflect a broader set of information for accountability and for decision making compared to what we would expect to see in private sector disclosures. And therefore, in applying this standard, the disclosure of material climate-related information will inform the decision-making of this much broader set of public sector users, and in turn will enable these users to hold public sector entities accountable for their climate action. And this information includes, for example, climate-related risks and opportunities that are affecting the entity itself, as well as how the entity itself contributes to climate action, and that's including through its greenhouse gas emissions. So now having outlined the key features of the IPSASB SRS-1, I'll now turn over to transition relief and our next steps in supporting adoption and implementation of the standard. Now, this standard includes transitional provisions for the first year of reporting, where entities are not required to disclose comparative information in the first year, and they can also report climate-related disclosures after publishing financial statements rather than at the same time. And considering the need for more time in the public sector to develop systems and to gradually build data availability in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the standard includes a 3-year transition period for disclosing Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And this was something that was clearly informed to the IPSASB by our constituents in the public sector during our public consultation. In terms of the effective dates, as Alex has brought us through in the first couple of slides, the standard will be effective on the 1st of January 2028. And the IPSASB's next steps as part of phase 1 of this project will be to work on supporting adoption and implementation of the standard. So from this year, so 2026 onwards, the IPSASB's focus will be to develop implementation material to support this published standard, as well as to continue our conversations with preparers, particularly through our Sustainability Implementation Forum. And this is a group of preparers in the public sector that have been supporting the IPSASB on our journey of developing the IPSASB SRS-1. And this group of preparers will continue to act as a key resource for the IPSASB going forwards through informing adoption and implementation of the IPSASB SRS standards by providing us with practical feedback from their real-life examples to let us know whether the standard is actually practical and feasible. And this will, we see that this will support the adoption and implementation of the IPSASB SRS-1 by letting us know whether further areas might be challenging for entities and where further areas of clarification, further implementation support might be needed. And I'd say the greatest value add of this Sustainability Implementation Forum is it acts as a community of practice that empowers public sector entities around the world to lead on the implementation of the IPSASB SRS-1. So if you are a preparer listening to this webinar and you're interested to learn more about the Sustainability Implementation Forum, please get in contact with us and we can reach out to you to share more details about this forum. So we hope that this overview of the disclosure requirements of the IPSASB SRS-1 was informative for you. And with that, we would like now to open the session for questions and discussions. Do welcome all your thoughts and reflections and also any questions for Alex and I as well. So we'll have a QR code up on the next slide that you can submit any questions that Alex and I will answer.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. And I might actually just start us because we have a number of questions that have gone into the Zoom platform in the Q&A area. So if I just draw from a few of those as everyone then makes use of Slido. So if you're able to use the QR code and bring that up. Yeah, we have an example that started here. I'll just do a couple at least from our Zoom platform as well. So there's one here from Kevin Martinborough who says, why wait until 2028 to implement the framework, seeing that public sector's effective use of resource is paramount? So hearing there from Kevin about the urgency around implementation of these this climate-related guidance. And Kevin, I think the main message we'd like to offer to you there is that, of course, the effective date is January 2028, but of course, early adoption is permitted. So for those entities, and if Kevin, you're working in one of those, if you're ready to implement, then start now. There is no need to wait with that, and that's very much encouraged. Anything else on that, Karen?
No, I see that there's also a question for whether there's a timeline for phase 2 from Jake, and that's something that the IPSASB will actually be starting its discussions in our March meeting. So in around a month's time, the IPSASB will be starting our initial discussions on phase 2. Our current timeline that we've very initially mapped is until the end of 2026, but that would be depending on board deliberations and the thinking that goes behind that. But right now, this is a very preliminary timeline by the board, and will likely go through multiple discussions, both quarterly or scheduled quarterly board discussions, and also through our quarterly board check-in meetings, which you can follow through the IPSASB YouTube.
Maybe just going straight to the next one, Karen, on that list that you had there. So why is it allowed to publish sustainability information later than the GPFRs, although the disclosure should be done in GPFR? So this is from an anonymous attendee. And I think just to clarify there, that was, Karen, you were setting out the transition reliefs for us a moment ago, where in the first year, an entity could provide their sustainability disclosures within 9 months. of your financial reporting. And that's more just that you would likely be setting up the necessary systems, processes, and preparing those disclosures and providing some flexibility around the time at which that's published. From there, the expectation then is that it would be published at the same time after that first year release. So this is just a transition release that's in place. So I hope that helps for the anonymous question there.
Now we have a
We have
lot of
some
questions
coming in.
coming in.
Yeah, we kind of come from both, Karen, don't we?
We have a lot of questions coming in.
Good.
But yes, free online course about the practical implementation of the standard. If you can see from the IPSASB webpage, there is currently a webcast that Alex and I have put together. It's about an hour long and full, and it provides, I'd say it provides a detailed overview of the disclosure requirements. But then also the IPSASB is looking to provide further implementation support, and that includes, for example, further webcasts on specific areas of challenges, and that's going to be informed through our Sustainability Implementation Forum, hopefully.
Excellent. Yeah, and Karen, maybe if I respond then to Bailey's question here that we see on the slide. So Bailey's asked, can you comment on how adoption application of this climate disclosure standard might vary by level of government? And I think, yeah, really important question there, Bailey, because one thing that we did share with you is that the expectation of the board is that IPSASB SRS 1 should apply across all public sector entities. So it should be relevant then to the different levels of government in a jurisdiction. And what I might start by offering you there, Bailey, to answer this question is that what IPSASB SRS 1 provides is a set of principles by which an entity would offer its climate-related disclosures. And I think that's really useful in the fact that, of course, across different levels of government, across actually different types of entities, there's then sufficient flexibility to apply those principles within your own context. And maybe just to link briefly then to another question we've had from someone in the Zoom Q&A, which was around GRI and how that sits within SRS 1. That's then something where if you look at the materiality guidance that Karen was sharing with us, there are a set of steps that are articulated of what an entity would do to establish what is material information for its disclosure. The first step there is understanding the entity's context. And that first step is actually drawn from GRI guidance and helping to understand that context of what's then going to be relevant information or material information for primary users at that different level of government. So I think there's lots you could unpick there. It should work for an entity delivering services. It should equally work for an entity that is internal and providing policy advice in terms of its own activities, the offices it runs in providing that policy advice.
No, there's the question that came through Slido on what was covered by the qualitative characteristics appendix, and this is something that the IPSASB took from our own IPSASB conceptual framework, so drawing on our own IPSASB literature. And so examples of what it covers includes qualitative characteristics, relevance, understandability, faithful representation, timeliness, comparability, verifiability. So these are something that you can find in Appendix C of the IPSASB SRS standard. And we also have a question on, is there a requirement to implement IPSASB SRS standards if one uses the IPSAS the financial IPSAS? And this is something that we did cover in the application of the standard. This is a question that we get quite often, but no, there is no requirements. Both these standards may be adopted independently, regardless of whether you adopt one or the other.
So just to get maybe just a few more, I think we're moving between our two platforms here, Karen, aren't we? So we have Yakuba asking if there's any translation agenda in place of what will be coming through. I'm not sure if that's been discussed, Karen, or if that's still pending at the moment of language availability for SRS 1.
So I think translations are we always welcome translations. no plans from the IPSASB team right now. But then if you go on the IPSASB website where we have the IPSASB SRS1, there you can entities can request permission to translate the document provide it to provide accessibility to a wider group of users.
We have a few questions here about double materiality. Karen, do you want to jump in on this, given that you're sharing those insights with us on materiality?
Yeah, so this is something that the IPSASB did deliberate in terms of in terms of where we first started with materiality, and we actually brought in different experts and practitioners in sustainability to help the IPSASB really understand what double materiality is and what the different materiality labels that are currently in the sustainability landscape. And ultimately, the IPSASB decided that the definition in our own conceptual framework actually, without drawing from any other labels, already provides us with that information need that is useful to essentially information that these citizens and taxpayers would need in order to hold public sector entities accountable for their climate action. And so that's why the IPSASB eventually landed without drawing on any of these external, we call them external definitions, with the IPSASB's own definition from our own literature. So it's not attached to any of these double materiality labels, but when you think of it, the set of users, when you try to fulfill these information needs, meet the information needs of this much broader set of users, we're actually looking at something that's broader than what you call in the private sector as perhaps as financial materiality.
A really important one that we've had lots of outreach discussion on as well, Karen, right? So good to see that coming up here. Maybe as we scroll down for other ones, I'll just grab one from the Zoom Q&A, which is from George. And he's asked, did the effective date consider the fact that most countries in Africa are trying to transition to IPSAS from either cash or modified cash towards accrual, and considered that SRS1 would synchronize to that transition rather than appearing as a new project? So I think that this is something that the board has been really conscious of and has shown up in many deliberations, is thinking about the implementation of sustainability reporting within a public sector context, and being well aware, given that the IPSASB develops an index that looks at the pace of adoption and implementation of financial reporting globally, that there's what I've previously called a decade of transition happening right now. So we do see that up to 2030, the expectation is that it's close to 3 out of 4 central governments would be moving towards accrual basis, and a lot of those across developing and emerging economies, George, as well. So that is, very much front of mind for IPSASB in its own deliberations. I think there's the advantage, of course, that these are then separate suites of standards, where an entity could be moving towards full compliance on the accrual basis with IPSAS, and might sequence that instead, or would be able to reflect on its own PFM reform strategy in a way that would make that most useful.
And now we see what I can see here from the Slido screen is that there's a few questions on implementation. What's the IPSASB doing to support implementation of these sustainability standards? And will the IPSASB provide further implementation guidance? And the question is, the answer is yes, we will be working on supporting adoption and implementation. Our first step is working through our Sustainability Implementation Forum. As you've seen from the slides here, we have a Sustainability Implementation Forum, so a group of preparers that we've set up initially to support the development of this standard, to ensure that those disclosure requirements are practical and feasible, but also we're expecting that after the publication, as we move on to this implementation phase of the standard, that will continue to inform us with the challenges and perhaps some of the practical examples of them implementing a standard. within the SIF, I'd say we already have a few entities that have put a hand up, telling us that they are interested in potentially adopting the standard and also doing pilots of the standard. So there is great interest from that group of preparers. And if adoption and implementation is something that, if you're a preparer and this is something that you're interested in, please get in touch with us. And this is something that we'd be happy to have everyone participate in. This is an open forum.
Yeah, a really important call to action there, Karen. We're really keen to have the full variety of views and experiences on implementing sustainability reporting in the public sector context. I can see also, yeah, we have questions around public audit, and really impressive to see actually Andreas Bergman offering some answers in the Q&A, in the audience Q&A section here on this. So that's really good to see. Should we move maybe, Karen, to what we have here the Slido instead?
Yes, so I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then we'd have to move on to our IPSASB chair, Thomas, to provide us with some closing remarks. But great to see a lot of questions coming in for both Alex and I. It's great to see that there's a lot of interest in the IPSASB SRS-1, and this is not a one-time conversation. This is something that we see as a continuing conversation, and as I can see here, maybe it will be helpful that we provide further implementation support, maybe through webinars like this, to answer more questions. We do have a question on who should compile the disclosures. There are the board has considered this in developing the standard. This is something that the board has discussed in managing the disclosure burden from entities, and if you can see in the standard, there are provisions that will allow that can allow entities, if they don't have the available skills and capacities, that they would be able to make a statement to do so if that's beyond their entity's capacity.
Well, maybe I see that we're coming up to time as well, Karen, but what I might suggest here as well, I think you've done a great job in saying that maybe there's future work that we can do to remain engaged and to answer as many questions here as possible. But let's also take away these questions. So there's, I think, between probably 50, 60 plus questions for us to reflect on the areas from what we're hearing from all of you as important to understanding this new standard from the IPSASB. So don't see these as in vain, but really important signals for IPSASB staff and for the board to reflect on how we provide the best support in the months ahead.
So thank you all for all your questions. With that, I will now hand over to our IPSASB chair, Thomas Müller-Marqués Berger, again for some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Alex. And actually, let me start my closing remarks by thanking you, the team, for the great work done in the past months, and of course today. I also want to thank the great communications team in the background for setting up this webinar. But finally, of course, I want to thank you very much, you all, for joining us today and for your great engagement throughout this webinar. I think it's pretty clear that the publication of the IPSASB SRS-1 climate-related disclosures is definitely an important milestone for the IPSASB and for the public sector globally. And just having heard the questions coming in and the kind of request for implementation support, I think it's great having heard from the Q&A that participants are suggesting not to wait, but to start immediately with the implementation. And I think this is actually where my closing remarks are pointing to. We are only at the beginning of this journey, so the publication starts the next phase, and I think Karen has made that very clear, a phase where I'm personally passionate about and which I see as a key priority for the IPSASB in the period ahead, supporting public sector entities as they adopt and implement the standards, and very carefully listened to your requests for implementation support. And I can reassure you that as the IPSASB, we are committed to working closely with jurisdictions, with preparers and other stakeholders. And this is particularly through our Sustainability Implementation Forum, as Karen pointed out, to ensure that our standards remain practical, that they remain implementable, and they provide decision useful information. We recognize the rapidly evolving sustainability reporting landscape, and the IPSASB is listening very carefully, not only today, but on a continued basis, as Karen rightly said, to constituents as we build on IPSASB as one and develop further public sector guidance in this area. And actually, you can help shaping that future. The IPSASB's work program consultation is open now, and I would encourage all of you to submit your comments, and by that, let us know where your priorities are in this area. So please stay engaged with our work, connect with us on social media. We have great experts on social media here with us, and keep up to date with our discussions. So thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. So in that sense, all the best and goodbye.